Today we are continuing our investigation of Bank of America's acquisition of Merrill Lynch. When we held our first hearing on this merger, I called it a shotgun wedding. Now it looks like a marriage of convenience. Ken Lewis got what he wanted, and the Treasury and the Feds got what they wanted. All of this happened against a backdrop of unchecked government power, with no transparency or accountability. Ken Lewis appears to have manipulated the accountable system to his benefit. He started this bailout in motion when he made the first phone call to Mr. Paulson that got the government involved. He got the Treasury to cough up $20 billion of taxpayers' money to help finance his merger. He never had to disclose $12 billion in Merrill Lynch losses to investors until it was over. He never had to ask the shareholders to reconsider the transaction. In the end, Mr. Lewis got everything he wanted. Mr. Paulson and Mr. Bernanke also got what they wanted out of this marriage. They got an uninterrupted merger that they believe helped to stabilize the market. The problem is that while all of this was going on, the American people, investors, and the Congress were kept in the dark. There was no oversight to determine whether this arrangement made sense. In my view, this is unacceptable and must be prevented from happening in the future. That being said, significant issues need to be resolved today. Was Bank of America really forced to go through with the deal, or was this just an old-fashioned Brooklyn shakedown? Did Ken Lewis threaten to back out of the deal in order to squeeze more money out of the federal government? If Mr. Paulson believed that Ken Lewis had demonstrated a colossal lack of judgment, why did he and Mr. Bernanke leave Lewis in charge of Bank of America? Did government officials tell Ken Lewis to keep quiet about the escalating losses at Merrill Lynch and the government's commitment to provide billions in federal funding? Did Congress make a mistake in conferring broad authority on the Fed and Treasury in October 2008 when the TARP Fund program was created? Should Congress have required more accountability, transparency, and checks and balances in the operation of the TARP funds? Perhaps Mr. Paulson will help us shed some further light on this transaction and help us to answer these questions. I look forward to his testimony this morning. I now yield 5 minutes to our ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Issa, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being a full partner in this process. Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent that the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Stearns, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Garrett, be allowed to sit in on the panel pursuant to our rules and ask questions at the end of all other questioners.
I think we're just going in.
I think it's 10 o'clock, we're just going in. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, after reading former Secretary Paulson's testimony, it's clear that most of the basic facts related to this event in December of last year are no longer in question. Secretary Paulson has confirmed that he did tell Bank of America CEO Ken Lewis that if the Bank of America exercised the MAC clause and later needed assistance, then management would or could, depending on how you look at it, be fired. This is not in debate. As a matter of fact, the candor and clarity that the Secretary is bringing to us today is refreshing and helpful. The fact that the Secretary does not believe it is inappropriate perhaps we should look at in light of the times. Just as revisionists have rewritten what we were doing after 2001 to protect the homeland, we are already beginning to question whether, in fact, means used at the disposal of the Fed and the Treasury and the FDIC were inappropriate or appropriate now that, of course, a global financial meltdown has been averted. I think, in fairness, just like in the Cold War, had the Soviets come over the Czech border, we would have had to come as we are and bring what we had. What we had at the beginning of this crisis was, in fact, a Secretary of the Treasury, relatively new on the job, a Fed chairman, relatively new on the job, all of whom were being told, here's what's happening on a daily basis, do something about it. They came to us with a plan that I voted against, a plan to buy toxic assets for some $700 billion. But when they went back and started looking at how to execute after receiving it, it became clear that it was more complex, that it was more nuanced, that the needs were not necessarily for toxic asset purchases, and that it might not be in the taxpayer's best interest. So although there will be some things that I approve of and some that I disapprove of, I think today, Mr. Chairman, we have to consider with this last witness the situation that existed at that time, one in which the President had lobbied heavily for monies, but without anyone having a book written on how you get through these times. Wall Street perhaps would say that the end justifies the means. We have in fact been saved. Here in Washington, we're Monday morning quarterbacks. Monday morning quarterbacks say, in fact, if we have to play again next Sunday, how do we do better? What can we learn from what happened on the gridiron on Sunday? Mr. Chairman, that's our job here today. We have to ask some serious questions and use an expert witness as part of the process. We have to ask, what would he do differently if he had it to do over again? He may or may not be able to answer it. What should we do in order to glean the causes, the events, the solutions, and in fact, what regulatory changes will be necessary or at least considered if we are to be prepared to either not have it happen again or, as the Chairman said, provide the transparency, accountability, predictability, and rule of law the next time that may have been lacking in this once-in-a-century event. So, Mr. Chairman, on a bipartisan basis, I am thrilled that we are bringing to a close this three-part hearing process because I believe is helpful and will continue to be helpful, not just as oversight, but as a partner in the necessary reform. And Mr. Chairman, I might take note that just yesterday, on the House side at least, all of the commissioners for the 9/11 style financial commission that you and I worked on together were named. That's a beginning of what could be up to an 18-month process in which I believe that both of us and all the members of our committee will be working together to ensure that our reforms fit future possible challenges. I thank the Chairman and yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Issa from California. This hearing is being conducted jointly with the Domestic Policy Subcommittee. I now yield 5 minutes for opening statement to the chairman of that subcommittee, Congressman Kucinich from Ohio.
Thank you very much, Mr.